Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about something that the media doesn't seem to have really covered this much or much at all, or the online commentary generally, which is candidate Donald Trump proposal or suggested policy position that he may remove all taxation on overtime pay. Now, I have some small knowledge of this, having administered payrolls in the past, but I want to talk sort of widely about this and consider some of the implications for and against, just in a broad sense. The idea of any work that a worker puts in above 40 hours a week, I think was Trump's proposal, which is overtime, would attract zero taxation. So the potential implications for productivity, for worker motivation, and for more cost-effective, in terms of an employer, more cost-effective means of getting things done, which I guess comes back into the productivity sort of thing and value for money and all that sort of good stuff, is that workers would be much more motivated and that their purchasing power would increase, and therefore this would be good for the economy, as in higher rates of productivity all around. There are also potential downsides, potential for employers to game the system, labour hire firms to game the system, and so on. So there would need to be some sort of structure to it and some sort of safeguards. But that's we'll come to that maybe in another video. But certainly that there will be those that, without question, will try and game the system. But overtime is treated differently in different countries, whether in the US or Canada or Australia and Britain and so on. But just looking at the US and different states, now in some cases, and also based on, for example, overtime in coal mining is treated differently than overtime if you're on the shop floor in a retail store. So overtime typically attracts either a 25% loading on top of the hourly rate. So let's say I'll just make it simple. Your hourly rate is $1. So if you work overtime in certain industries, the overtime after 40 hours, it goes to $1.25 an hour. After a certain number of hours, it goes to $1.50 an hour, then $1.75. Then if you're working over 40 hours, but on, say, a public holiday, like President's Day or Christmas Day, something like that, the loading goes from $1 an hour standard pay to, say, $2.50 an hour. So now, if someone, say, is already in one of the higher income taxation brackets, then and they're offered overtime, and they're already on a kind of a decent, above average type pay, and they're offered overtime, some of them will look at the tax and say, well, I'm going to be taxed 50 cents in the dollar here, or more than that, and I'm going to lose my free time, and I'm not having so much time with my family or recreational pursuits and so on. So they turn down the overtime and say, no, I'm not interested. Now, overtime is typically, not always, but typically offered to the most productive, most skilled, most capable workers. So if you've got someone who has particular skills you need, say in a retail, say takeout food store, something like that, you're looking at someone who's really good with customers, and so you may want to offer them the overtime, or say in some sort of a technical setting, someone's good at maintaining the machinery or maintaining the electronics, or in the factory or the warehouse, or a good forklift driver, something like that. That they're clearly well skilled, well experienced, knowledgeable. Then they would tend to get more of the overtime than someone who was less skilled, unskilled, or lazy, or whatever. So your more diligent, more capable workers are going to be offered the overtime. So this could create some distortions that otherwise might offer the overtime. So this could create some distortions that otherwise may not exist. But when your most productive, most skilled people who otherwise couldn't increase their income by any appreciable amount, they would do the overtime, and if they had no tax, then they would be benefiting quite substantially. Now, there are other offsets here as well. If an employer saying, well, I have to pay this person double time, so instead of $1 an hour, I've got to pay them $2 an hour overtime, but they're not getting taxed. So why should I, the employer, receive the full cost of this extra, whereas the employee gets a zero tax on their income? So shouldn't the overtime rate go down? Instead of $1 going to $2, as in, from when the overtime kicks in, overtime should not attract any additional amount. It should be just an additional $1 an hour, but without tax. Therefore, the worker is still benefiting, but the business owner or the company doesn't have to pay an additional rate for overtime. So this could substantially change relationship between loading rates, penalty rates, overtime rates. That could be one area that's affected. I think it would be. And then, of course, the benefit to the worker, which is, in the case of overtime, they're able to get extra hours of work, which isn't costing the business any more per hour, but they don't pay any tax, and therefore they don't pay any tax on the overtime hours. So therefore, they are clearly benefiting. And so if you look at the overall picture, everyone, technically at least, would benefit from this. What are some of the other possible implications? Well, let's suppose that Donald Trump does become president again, and we all hope that is the case, of course, or all sensible, reasonable people, the non-globalist people, the people who don't want to tear white society to pieces want that. So, and the mass deportations do take place. Now, whether those deportations, as in people are physically arrested and taken across the border, or measures such as all financial repatriations out of the US to other places, such as South America and elsewhere, are heavily taxed, then people would then self-deport, which would be probably the more desirable from an optics point of view. And so the opportunities for American-born workers would be increased in proportion, and therefore overtime would be offered. Now, in order to presumably take up some of the slack, assuming there is any slack to take. I doubt there is much slack to take up, and I think the jobs that these illegals and so on have are artificial jobs with artificially low pay that are unsustainable in a proper economy anyway, and I think they're causing very negative distortions by their mere existence in the US or in any Western country for that matter. So, but nonetheless, if there was then some sort of a realignment of jobs and positions and workers and work to be done and workers available to that work, then overtime would be a way of doing that. Now, it could also create a left behind sort of class where the least industrious, the laziest, and the people that go, you can go and shove your overtime and all that sort of thing, where they wouldn't get the overtime anyway. The keenest and the most industrious and the most capable will get the overtime. Now, it's fairly easy, especially if you're younger, but at any age, if you want to work 60 hours a week and that work's available, and if the overtime rates are just considered to be normal pay rates, but you don't pay tax on that overtime beyond 40 hours, then it's kind of an everybody benefits thing. But that jobs, that work, that extra hours would go to the most capable or the most industrious. Typically, there may be exceptions, such as no one else is available, so you give it to the low value worker. But typically, it's going to go to the most capable. Similarly, it's going to mean workers will have much more motivation to upskill, or increase their breadth of expertise. So if they know that they can get an extra 10, 15, 20 hours a week of work and they don't pay tax on it, then they could, in net terms, cash in hand at the end of the week, they could come close to doubling their income So businesses could offer in-house bridging and traineeship or capability courses. And if the government, the Trump administration offers extra tax breaks to companies doing that, then they could substantially increase and cross-skill, upskill, broaden skill their workforce. And then those most capable or keen or able or whatever to do those courses could easily acquire then these extra hours. Now remember, 20 hours of overtime without paying tax could come close to doubling your income. So the incentives would be huge for people to do that work. So the implications or the possible implications for workforce productivity are enormous, absolutely enormous. And this could potentially at least revolutionize work as in the relationship between the worker, capital, income, productivity, and so on. So it could potentially ignite this virtual sort of cycle and circle of higher skills, higher productivity. But it does mean that the hardest working, the keenest and the brightest and the most capable will then start rising to the top income-wise. So then we have the possibility where the equal outcomes, the equity brigade comes and say, well, that's not fair. The laziest, dumbest, most incompetent person should be getting equal outcomes with the hardest working and so on, that being the communist system. But this idea of rewarding the most capable and the hardest working, this would clearly be a way of doing it. Now, I don't know if, at the same time as this goes on, equity programs, affirmative action programs, race hustler programs, DEI programs all have to be shut down, I think, at the same time as this goes on. And if that is done, I think it would create a very meritorious scenario in terms of where income could relate to merit much more effectively and clearly than it does today. So I think this could be a good thing if the proper protections are put in place, against gaming the system in particular. But again, the realignments have to occur in a number of ways. And if that happens and this program does go through, I think it would be huge. And again, the productivity for the economy potentially could go through the roof. And again, it could really change the relationship that people have, the capability, a much larger group of people will be capable, for example, of buying their houses and things like that. So it could in itself recreate an American middle class, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So again, with the proper thinking it through carefully and well enough, I think this is potentially huge, and I'm surprised it's not getting more media coverage. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.
What's going to be huge?